Hi, welcome to another lecture. Here we are on this wonderful gray day, and we'll be covering the story by Nadine Gordimer, a South African writer, white South African writer, which maybe is important to kind of point out. The short story we're looking at here is entitled "The City of the Dead, a City of the Living." I've done extensive note-taking on this. I've kind of gone back to the story, kind of a second wave, to have a more kind of concise understanding, but I'm also recognizing how important it is to, kind of take it page by page as well. So one thing I think we should be generally aware of is that Nadine Gordimer, as a white woman, a South African white woman, tends to focus on issues of apartheid. A very prolific writer. I haven't read a ton of her work, just a few short stories here and there. This one, when I was doing a little bit of research as to what I should teach, this is one of her most notable pieces. And it's definitely dealing with issues of apartheid. Now, without getting into the textbook definition of what apartheid is, we do understand that it's kind of when a country imposes itself upon a particular people and then essentially makes them second-class citizens or kind of a subclass within their own country. And of course, South Africa is one of the most notable examples of this if we look at history. People who are very critical of the Israeli occupation of Gaza in the West Bank, they also claim that Israel is an apartheid kind of system or government, I should say, as they are kind of occupying Palestinian ground, and within that occupation making the Palestinians themselves second-class citizens or a subclass that has a severe lack of rights and privileges with. There are some modern-day examples of apartheid here if you're looking at it through a pretty critical lens here. So we begin on page 1, and it starts off with a pretty interesting statement, and it reads, quote, you only count the days if you are waiting to have a baby or you are in prison. Now, we do have a baby in this text. We're not waiting to have a baby. There is a child that has been born, and I guess, not the easiest thing to analyze, but you do see that there is a developing relationship between the visitor, Shisonka, and that baby, right? That they do have some kind of interactions here and there, and that Nanike is quite protective of her child, as any mother should be, especially if it's a visitor that you have very little familiarity with and that you haven't spent a lot of time with. So we do see that there is this idea of child in the text, or if you are in prison. So I guess we're just trying to strike at the similarities between this idea of waiting to have a child and counting the days and this kind of impatience or this anxiety or anticipation, as well as this idea of kind of being in prison. Again, nobody's in prison in this text, but maybe we look at Shisonka in such a way as to say he is kind of in prison when he's spending this time in their home. And of course, she's imprisoned by having Shisonka in her home as well, right? We know that there are many times throughout this text where she would rather have him leave, but of course he is staying. The third big paragraph. Well, it is important that the Shebeen keeper, not sure if I'm pronouncing that exactly right, the Shebeen keeper. Now, a Shebeen is an illicit bar or club that sells liquor without a license. So when we talk about the Shebeen, a big symbol that we have to utilize and have an understanding of is liquor and alcohol. And I guess I can deal with this one really quickly because it's quite literal. What does liquor and alcohol tend to do? it does tend to kind of numb people to the real pain and the real disruptances of their life, right? So we definitely understand that. It's a numbing agent, right? Along those same lines, perhaps we also understand it can be a major distraction, right? Instead of dealing with things that have to be dealt with, I will just have a drink or two or three or four, and I will go down this different kind of path as far as alcohol use is concerned, and that will distract me from some other pressing matters that maybe need my attention in my life. So a numbing agent, a major distraction here, and we'll definitely see some evidence of this throughout this text. But it is important to note, you know, what is the author doing? She's making us aware of the Shebeen keeper right in the second paragraph of this home. In the next paragraph, the big paragraph, this is where, you know, again, knowing a little bit about Nadine Gordimer, knowing that she is a South American writer, this big third paragraph really reminds me of kind of division and separation, and that's what apartheid is all about, is really creating a very strict and rigid social structure so that a certain group of people, namely the British, because I think mostly we have a kind of description of the British here. The British stay on top as far as power, control, and influence, who's in control of resources, etc. within South Africa, and then the people themselves, the South Africans themselves, the indigenous population of this land, become a secondary class of individuals, and we get a lot of that talk of division within this paragraph. There's an interesting couple details, if I can just pick them out very quickly. The Shebeen keeper has a car. She is, I guess you could say, fortunate enough, or maybe a better word is privileged enough, to have an automobile. Now we know that the house across the street where Nanike and Samson and Shisonka will visit, where they reside, the garage has been reappropriated for an actual room for people to live in. But it does mention in this paragraph that at one point that garage held a car. It says maybe there was a guy who owned a taxi, who ran a taxi car business right out of his house. But at one point there was a car there. Now, to speak in totality, just so that I'm getting these, you know, the ball rolling on these themes, it's this idea that this house, which is primarily filled with South Africans, right, African individuals, they too had a car at one point, meaning, figuratively, they too possessed a certain glory and richness and wealth before, of course, they were exploited by and subjugated by this British Empire. The Dutch, of course, are a part of this too, if you know the history of it all, but the British especially, before they are exploited and subjugated by a British Empire here. But at some point there was a garage, there was an automobile that could match the grandness and the luster of the Shebeen keeper, or in other words, the British Empire. They had these this wealth as well. They had this potential as well. Another little detail that sticks out for me, I'll just read the quote. There is a large varnished print of a horse with wild orange mane and flaring nostrils on the wall. And this is, of course, is within this subdivided home. When I think of this image of this horse, wild orange mane, I think of freedom, right? A limitless and proud freedom that the South African people once had, again, before the subjugation, and perhaps still have, but have to kind of fight to reclaim and restore. And of course, now we talk about Shisonka in that regard. Flaring nostrils on the wall. You think of this horse with wild mane, flaring nostrils, which is a certain kind of power, right? When you think of those flaring nostrils. This painting on the wall represents, or print, it's not a painting, but a print of this horse. This represents the potential of the South African people, if they can somehow continue to break the chains, or at least kind of loosen the chains of their British oppressors, right? Okay, very good. The Shebeen keeper is given a touch of omniscience. It says that the Shebeen keeper knows everything about everyone. So there's this touch of omniscience that is given to the Shebeen keeper. A smaller theme, it might kind of bloom into more importance, is the lack of privacy within Samson's home, with the many people that live there, whether it be single individuals or smaller families. There is definitely a kind of lack of privacy within this home. It does make some reference to a little kind of garden area within this this structure, and they are grapevines. Now, I don't think, part of me, I've read so much literature where I'm always on the kind of hunt for religious symbolism, but I'm not sure it applies too much to what we're reading here. It's a possibility, of course, but whenever I hear of grapevines, you do think there is this kind of idea that's linked to Christ. And the idea of the grapevines is the grapevines will grow if you are in favor of Jesus and God. The grapevines will kind of decay and essentially fail, the grapevines, if you are out of favor. But I'm not sure if that's necessarily plugging in a meaningful way here. So, to say the least, this home has been generally repurposed. What was once a home for one family, a single collection of life, is now repurposed for a multitude of persons, all who are doing the best they can to make ends meet. They all do so in various ways, which means that the life that this home was initially perhaps ideally built for is no longer a possibility. Okay. Now, this is interesting. A lot of the features, whether it be the furniture or other things, curtains within this home, I'll just read the quote here, have been discarded by the various employers for whom Moreke, and that's Samson Moreke, works in the city as an itinerant gardener. The arbor is between the garage and the lavatory, which is shared by everyone on the property, both tenants and lodgers. To get a little bit ahead of kind of where we are currently in the text, it's this idea that everything is being repurposed, everything is being salvaged, right? Whatever things of use or things of value that Samson Moreke does have within this home, he's getting from his employers. And I think it can probably be safe to say we are talking about white employers. A big part of apartheid is that you don't make the resources of that land and the work that goes into the extraction of these resources of the people of that land, you don't make it worth their while. It's this idea that the South Africans themselves do not bear the reward or bear, in other words, the fruit that the land is generating. Right? So the British come in as a colonialist empire, and they essentially make the country work in terms of their own interests, not the interests of the African people themselves. So that's something that Shisonka will talk about later on in the text, as he says, everything you do is for the white man. All the hard work, all the blood, the sweat, and the tears that you endure are not essentially propping you up or are working in your interests, but are working in the interests of your white superiors, right? The British themselves. So there's a lot of drunks that they love to come and see Samson. They love to come and talk to him, to interact with him. The drunks, whether family, friends, or acquaintances, divert Samson's attention away from the potential to politicize himself, which for him comes in the shape and form of reading these newspapers. This is the third paragraph on page 2. As well as friends and relatives, acquaintances of Moreke, who have got to know where he lives through traveling with him on the buses to work, walk over from the Shebeen and appear in the yard. Moreke is a man who always puts aside money to buy the Sunday newspaper. He has to fold away the paper and talk instead. So what we recognize is, in an attempt to politicize himself, to make him aware of kind of political, social, or even cultural issues that are currently occurring in his area, instead he has to kind of fold up this newspaper, fold up this endeavor to politicize himself and talk to these drunks, right? And essentially kind of entertain them with small talk. So that's one of the big ideas here is the politicization of Moreke. We do understand that Shisonka is deeply politicized. He is so politicized that he has taken it upon himself to burn down what he feels is an offensive and oppressive example of the apartheid system, which is a police office, right, which is a police station. We will get into this idea of it's one thing to simply just have an opinion that action needs to occur or that there are problems that are in existence. It's another thing to act upon those opinions and actually do something about it, which in some virtuous way Shisonka has done, as he has burned down what he feels is a very clear kind of extension of the apartheid system, right? An extension of British power. And he has burned it down as to eradicate it from South America, right? But here, back to just the point that's being made here, what gets in the way of even contemplating this need for politicization or this awareness of political and social issues, economic issues, all these drunks coming and going and kind of talking. You know, it does make me think about all of the numerous distractions that abound within our own culture, within our own country, that keep us from exploring more important issues. For instance, and this is not my own idea, this is coming from Chomsky, but he says that sports is one of the biggest distractions that exists. If we think about the year 2017 here, I would imagine video games would be just as high on that list, knowing that it's $1 billion industry. And so many of our young folk, myself included, I'm playing Witcher 3 currently, right? Not that I'm logging in that many hours on it, but the idea is if we just engage in a kind of sports participation, and I'm not talking about playing sports, I'm talking about the spectator status of sports, right? Following teams nonstop, the new level of this, which is fantasy football, and how we endlessly participate in this. The more we pay attention to sports, the more we pay attention to celebrity culture, the more we pay attention to video games, is this taking us away from more pressing issues such as the economy, more pressing issues such as confronting our government to make positive changes within our own country or the world? Are we simply being distracted? And here we have, at least within the microcosm of this text, a little bit of a distraction here as he has to pay attention to these drunks. With that in mind, let me just read off some of the more general notes that I've put together here. So a quick brief interpretation of the title, A City of the Dead, A City of the Living. I think it has a lot to do with this idea of kind of awareness and how much we politicize ourselves. In another course that I teach here at Moorpark, my 1A class, we read Chomsky's book, or at least a few chapters out of Chomsky's book, Profit Over People. And one of the points he makes is what the neoliberalistic establishment is trying to do is depoliticize your average day, your average individual, right? Your kind of, your commoner, so to speak, like me and you, other people out there. They don't want you getting involved in political matters. They would rather you find some level of distraction. They would rather you feel absolutely powerless as far as your involvement and working toward, change that you think would be beneficial, and they want to make sure that they depoliticize you as much as possible. So I think that's one way of looking at the title of this piece and the overall interpretation of this piece. So a brief interpretation of the title. It feels as if there are two sides to living. One, to be aware of systemic injustice, such as in South Africa, the apartheid system that we're talking about, and to actively have a voice and be a body of action against it, much like Shisonka, right? And two, the other would be the city of the dead, perhaps, to numb yourself to it and simply go on with your life. Civil disobedience in some respects, as in your opinion can only get you so far. That's one way of interpreting it. He's going to talk about a city that he explores, that Shisonka will talk about a city that he explores that has a major impact upon his understanding of himself and his people when he talks about the oldest city in the world that he visits here. With this contrast in mind, we have to realize that we are dealing with rural folk who are in some sense numbed or unaware of the full extent of white control and domination in South Africa. Remember that when we talk about the context of this piece, we are talking about people who live more out in rural areas, who it even mentions have to take buses into the city, where when we get into the city, sometimes you're talking about higher levels of education, and now you're talking about higher levels of awareness of injustice and issues that are important to the people. Whereas in the rural countrysides, there might be less of an awareness because there's less of an educational system in place. Sometimes that's the case. The man understands this control more readily because he has spent time in the cities, reads newspapers, and is politicized to the point of action, unlike Samson. We do know that Shisonka has spent a lot of time in these cities, including cities abroad here. So he's kind of broadened his perspective and kind of gotten outside of the bubble that Samson and Nanike do live in. Just to say one more couple things here. The visitation of the city, the oldest city on the African continent, precedes this man Shisonka's decision to burn down the police station, which is a symbol of the lingering authority and domination of the British Empire. By visiting the oldest city in Africa, what you're on the African continent, what he has essentially done is to revisit the potential of the African people themselves before colonization, before exploitation, before subjugation by white empires, European empires. So he's revisiting the very real glory of his people, and that is reminding him that he must kind of push for this agenda and try to displace or remove the British Empire. Okay. Therefore, that city represents the idea of entombment of ideas and virtues. Perhaps it's the notion of African autonomy, right? African people being in charge of their own destinies. That's what it's all about. That's what autonomy is. And that's why it's a major component of revolutions and endeavors for independence, right? Autonomy. I work hard so that I can bear the fruit of my own hard work, not just working for somebody else, which is the point that Shisonka makes. Perhaps, so I'll just repeat that, perhaps it's the notion of African autonomy and benefiting from your own labor and agency and not being monitored, controlled in your own land, which of course is what we have when we talk about apartheid, okay? It even mentions that all these drunks that walk over from the Shebeen, they ruin it for even the sober people. And I'll just read this. This is the third paragraph on page 2. All weekend, drunks wander over the ruts that make the gait even of the sober seem drunken. So what you have here is literally the drunk people make this kind of careless and perilous track, right? You can imagine the way they're walking. And then what it mentions here is literally that makes it hard for even sober people to walk. So on a figurative level, the distraction and the numbness that's coming from this consumption of alcohol is making it even hard for people who don't feel the need to be distracted to have a kind of straightforward agenda as far as confronting their governments or confronting the powers that be. So it's even making it hard for the sober people, such as Samson, who tends to definitely represent a certain level of sobriety throughout the text. Shisonka is on a whole nother level of sobriety because he's gotten so sober to the issues that affect South Africa and the South African people that he's actually dedicated himself to action. That's complete sobriety, right? That's complete sobriety. All right, very good. So we talk about the child for a moment. Not that the child gets much description within the text, but the baby does have its moments. And this is on page 3. And I think the kind of literal description here we can look at in a more broad, figurative way. And it says that, I'll just read here, this is several paragraphs down, middle of page 3. The baby lost the nipple and nuzzled furiously at air. She guided its mouth, she being Nanike. Why can't he stay with Matumbo? You could have told Matumbo no. So you have, literally, you have a baby who's lost the nipple as it's breastfeeding, and the baby is furiously trying to get that nipple back in its mouth. Almost doesn't know what to do, right? As it says, the baby is actually in need of guidance, right? Let me bring the baby back. So I think this is a good way of thinking about Nanike in some respects, right? Nanike represents, within this text, she represents an individual who is not politicized at all, right? In fact, I don't think she has much of an awareness of what's taking place beyond her home and her needs for that child. We also understand that the child has a major dependency on the mother, like any baby or infant or a toddler would, and needs to have this kind of guidance back to this nourishment. I think what this reminds me of is at the very end of the text, you have the Shebeen keeper who offers a moment of kindness and attention to Nanike, especially in a great time of need, when Nanike is struggling with housing Shisonka, and especially when she finds out a little bit about the crimes that he has committed, right? And she feels a little worried about this. So it's almost as if throughout this text, she is this baby who has lost that kind of dependency on the British Empire for some sense of value and for some sense of identity. And throughout this text, you could argue and have the kind of evidence for it that she's lost that, right? She is this baby who's kind of doesn't know what to do. She's lost the security and the comfort of that nipple. And then, of course, at the very end of the text, she's given that kind of kindness from the Shebeen keeper once again, and she's kind of brought back into it. Brought back into it so much that what does she do? She goes and essentially gives up the location and rats on Shisonka, and he of course is captured, right? He is taken away. So that could be a way of thinking about the baby's dependence and the baby furiously looking for this nipple once he has lost it. So the act of giving shelter to Shisonka, this political miscreant or defector, is a political act in itself, and I think she starts to recognize that maybe in some subtle ways here. So at the bottom of page 4, this is when we start to recognize the influence of Shisonka. And I want to apologize if I've been saying it Shisonka. I want to make sure we all understand it is pronounced, as you obviously probably know, Shisonka. Right? So I want to make sure I say these names correctly. Shisonka. So we start to recognize the influence that Shisonka is having on Samson at the bottom of page 4. I'll just read this briefly. Every night that week the two men talked. Not in the room with the sofa and radio and cassette player, if the woman lodger was at home on the other side of the curtains, but in the room where the Morekes slept. The man had a kitchen chair Moreke brought in. There was just room for it between the big bed and the wardrobe. Moreke lay on the bed with a pillow stuffed under his nape. Sometimes his wife stayed in the kitchen. At other times she came in and sat with the baby on the bed. She could see Moreke's face in the back of the man's head in the panel mirror of the wardrobe while they talked. The shape of the head swelled up from the thin neck, a puffball of black kapok. Deep in there was a small patch without hair, a skin infection or a healed wound. His front aspect, a narrow yellow face keenly attentive, cigarette wagging like a finger from the corner of his lips, a loop of gold around the lobe of one of the alert pointed ears, seemed unaware of the blemish, something that attacked him unnoticed from behind. So a couple things here. He does have a wound, but he seems almost unnoticing of the wound, right? And he has given these alert pointed ears this level of being alert as well. Next paragraph, this is probably the more important one. They talked about the things that interested Moreke. the political meetings disguised as church services, of which he had read reports but did not attend. The man laughed and argued with Moreke patiently. "What's the use, man? If you don't stand there, stand with your feet as well as agree with your head. Yes, go and get that head knocked off if the dogs and the carries come. Since 76, the kids have shown you how. You know how." So this took a little bit of looking up some information. So we're talking about 1976. My gosh, doesn't seem that long ago. But what we're talking about there is what's known as the Soweta Uprising. This, of course, is a part of South African political history here. The Soweta Uprising. This was a series of protests led by black school children who began marching on June 16th, 1976. So you have school children, right? People who have been educated to a certain degree who are marching against their government, right? Or marching essentially against the British control of their country. They were met with severe police brutality. There's a range between 176 to 700 dead. That's quite an event. That's a lot of dead people who were massacred in this uprising. The 16th of June is now a public holiday in South Africa. So what Shisonka is saying here is you learn from these kids. You learn from the Soweta Uprising. And one thing he mentions here is this idea that you can't just be full of opinion. Opinion only gets you so far. In fact, this is reminiscent of Henry David Thoreau's Civil Disobedience. If you've read the essay, he does make the point. He really criticizes people who only harbor an opinion on important matters and people who don't take action beyond that opinion. He even goes on to say that even voting, you know, we get so excited when we think about our right to vote, especially within this country, or really in any country throughout the world where we're given this democratic right, and people have died for your right to vote, and you hear a lot of this rhetoric. But Thoreau is very critical of this idea because the way he puts it is, I cast a vote, I vote for this bill, or I vote for this politician, and I'm really not taking any action beyond that vote. It's simply expressing an opinion, and I cross my fingers and hope that it comes true, but if it doesn't, guess what? I just sit back in my chair and I'm like, oh well, that didn't work out. And Thoreau argues that we have to go further than that, that we have to take action, right? Shisonka is making the same point here. He's saying, you know, you can go to these meetings, you can read about these things in the newspaper, and you can talk with your friends and talk with your acquaintances and share opinions, but if you're not moving beyond that and taking action, just like these black children in the Soweta Uprising, just like they did. Let's learn from these kids. They not only had opinions, they took action beyond that. That's what Shisonka is trying to remind us of, right? And trying to remind Samson as well. Just in case you were wondering, carries, which is mentioned in that first full paragraph on page 5, it's almost like a it's kind of like a club of sorts, right? And you'll find that both the protesters and the police will carry these clubs. So we're talking about a real violence being inflicted by these clubs. You know, what this reminds me of is if you choose to politicize yourself to the degree that Shisonka is talking about here, then expect risk. You will incur the risk of violence or some kind of retaliation by whatever government or whatever oppressive faction that you are standing up against or resisting. So I think that's the point he's making here too. You know, resistance is not just comfortably reading a newspaper and kind of internalizing the issues of your people from your living room, right? Resistance is action, and action can lead to a real form of risk, and I think that's the point that Shisonka is making here. Here also we get a distinction between councils and committees, and I'll just read the notes that I have here because I think this is just a little bit easier. we talked about this whole idea of stand with your feet as well as agree with your head. So whatever you're thinking needs to also be represented by your body as well, the actions you're willing to take. And again, we talked about the connections to civil disobedience there. And this is where Samson fails. He has not stood with his feet. He has taken action. He has not taken action to support his opinions and his convictions. This is reinforced by his feelings toward the urban councils, which are essentially as described here in this text, and probably if we were to look into real record on this, these councils, these urban councils, are highly influenced by British control. And the committees, on the other hand, which Samson are kind of more locally controlled. But Samson treats he treats the councils and the committees as something. It's mentioned, it's similar to how he gives opinions on soccer matches, which we have to remind ourselves when, in the grand scheme of life, sports is incredibly trivial. When it comes to people starving in the streets, when it comes to people not being able to stand up for their own rights and their own kind of self-interest or the interest of their own people because of these oppressive governments, sports is incredibly trivial. So maybe that's one of the problems we find in this country too, especially with all the news media that surrounds us. We are passing judgment and opinions on very important issues, the same that we pass judgment and opinions on sports. It's all the same thing, right? Which means that we're treating them in very trivial ways, and we have to take them much more seriously. I'll read this paragraph. This is the second main paragraph on page 2. This is pretty abrupt and pretty direct and explicit, so I just want to read this so it kind of provides a context for us. Moreke wanted to tell the man what he thought of the urban councils the authorities wanted to set up, and the committee's people themselves had formed in opposition. As, when he found himself in the company of a sports promoter, he wanted to give his opinion of the state of soccer today. So again, that's a very disturbing simile for us, because we recognize that he's giving the same level of kind of thought and consideration to these very important kind of distinctions and conflicts that reside between the urban councils and the committees, as very similar to how he would look at sports games, right, and just passing opinions on sports. Those councilmen are nothing to me. You understand. They only want big jobs and smart cars for themselves. I'm a poor man. I'll never have a car. That's interesting because remember, his home used to harbor a car, and you can resort to the earlier analysis that I gave here. The only other person who owns a car here is the Shebeen keeper, whose role within this story is to numb people and distract them from reading newspapers, or to politicize themselves, at least to a point of awareness. Moving on, but they say they're going to make this place like a white Joburg. That would be Johannesburg, which is a major city, if not the capital, but I would have to fact check that. My geography is not so strong, of South Africa. Maybe the government listens to them. They say they can do it. The committees, They say like I do, those councilmen are nothing. But they themselves, what can they do? There's that feeling of powerlessness. Even if we form these committees and they have our kind of local interests or the interests of actual South African people in mind, what can they do? How can they stand up to such a powerful force? And I think there's that defeatism, that feeling that you cannot enact change. And so what do? What's the next step after that? You just kind of lay down, right? And you surrender yourself to the will of another who obviously has been taking advantage of you for quite some time. So there's that defeatism taking place there. Back to read the final lines here. They know everything is no good here. They talk. They tell us about it. They go to jail. So what's the use? What can you do? Well, Shisonka would probably mention one thing you can do, which is to essentially burn down instances of their authority, power, and control. You know what this, as I talk about it, what it reminds me of, a very, very, very clearly is William Faulkner's barn burning, where you have the protagonist's father, Abner Snopes, who takes it upon himself to burn down the barns of plantation properties as to burn down all memories of the aristocratic South and the unjust power and influence and the activity that led to that power and influence. And he's burning all of that down. So it's very similar to that. Okay. And then the next paragraph, the man did not tell what he had done, because he did do something. He took action. He didn't feel powerless. He did something. The police station was there, ready in their minds, ready to their tongues, not spoken. You can always do that. You can always burn down that police station, right? Next paragraph, I'll just read. There's a lot taking place on page 5. This is right after they're thinking about the police station, but it's unspoken, right? The man was smiling at Moreke, at something he had heard many times before and might be leaving behind for good now. Your counsel, those dummies. You see this dunga-culda street outside, this place without even electric light in their rooms. You dig beautiful gardens, the flowers smell nice, and how many people must shit in that stinking hovel in your yard? How much do you get for digging the ground white people own? That's what it is. How much do you get? What value and benefit do you get for digging the ground that white people own? White people reap the benefits, right? Africans work, white people bear the fruits of that work. The British. You told me what you get. Top wages, 10 rand a day. Just enough for the rent in this place, and not even the shit house belongs to you. Not even the mud you bring in from the yard on your shoes. You might think that you have some benefit to the work that you do, but all of it is not yours, right? All of it is possessed by somebody else. There's no agency, right? There is no agency, there is no ownership for Africans in South Africa. That is what apartheid is all about, right? You provide services earnestly, you do work earnestly, with hope and heart and a general goodwill, but you are kept from what you deserve for this work. You do not bear the fruit of your own toil, the blood, and the sweat, and the tears that are a part of this toil. After this important discussion, this incredibly important discussion, what can you do, right? It's interesting that Nanike says you guys need a beer, which is essentially on a figurative level saying you guys need to numb yourselves to this talk. You know, this I get pretty passionate about, because I really do feel that within our culture, and I'm fortunate enough to be a professor and I get to read literature and, you know, share these ideas, expand upon these ideas, but I do feel that we avoid meaningful conversations, and that it's dangerous to even have these conversations in the first place about the unsettling nature of our situation, what we can do to resist power, right? These are difficult and sometimes uncomfortable conversations to have. So guess what? Let's stop right now and I'm going to go get a couple beers and we can just talk about, NBA or NFL, right? So much easier to do than talk about these difficult issues, because I guess the idea is the more and more we create an awareness of this injustice, the more and more we create an awareness of our suffering because of this injustice, and some greater for others than myself or maybe yourself. You know, I am always reminding myself of how much suffering there is going out there, how much injustice there actually is, even if I'm not the one who is suffering or faced with this injustice on a daily basis. I always try to remind myself, and that's the beautiful thing about literature and reading, is that you are sharing in the suffering and the injustice that other people are feeling and dealing with. But maybe it's just easier not to have these conversations, right? I'll go get a couple beers, we'll talk about sports. Right, that sounds a lot easier. All right. Just to cover some quick symbolisms and motifs throughout the text, I can do this quite quickly. there is this idea of being sick. To be sick is to be in trouble. Shisonka is treated as if he is sick. There's the converted garage. We've talked about that. One we haven't talked about yet, though it's occurring here, is the idea of washing. Whether it be the clothes. He'll clean his gun later, right? He'll clean his gun, and he'll do this in front of Nanike. It's interesting that Shisonka gets to a point where he is comfortable enough to clean even that gun, which represents action and resistance, and he'll clean that right in front of Nanike. And of course, he will also clean his fingernails as well. We talked about the car and we talked about the alcohol. These are all motifs or literal objects or literal kind of occurrences throughout the short story that, as we've been discussing, have a much more broader and figurative and symbolic meaning to them, right? So motifs, and there's a few in this text. On this page, Shisonka talks about that oldest city in Africa. It's divided, it's got two parts to it. There's a city of the dead, there's a city of the living. You know, you can look at this in many different ways, but maybe it's this idea that we have to hold on to or preserve that city of the dead, which is old African heritage, which is an old Africa which, you know, incredibly predates any European intrusion or European coercion that eventually comes to be. So we're going way back in time. We have to dip back into that old Africa and keep it alive and keep that in the living part of the city. There are many different ways, and I look forward to seeing your interpretations of the oldest city in Africa, which is essentially mentioned here. He also mentions, Shisonka, how he spent time, it sounds like in a very foreign, snowy, very non-African type of place. The way I interpreted this, and I'll just read this so I don't have to spend too much time on this page. What is shocking is that he has encountered graciousness and self-reflecting white people. They're not all like the British, who are unrelenting in their ambitions to keep control of South Africa, right? He has encountered, this is Shisonka, gracious and self-reflecting white people, so self-reflecting that they themselves have entombed, buried their imperialist ships in museums. They understand that imperialism is a dead era, that it is a part of the past, and they are putting these in museums. Why do we put things in museums, especially historical museums? Because we are, I guess in some ways we're preserving the past. That's one way you could see it. But another way is that we are saying that this is the past, and this is not the way the world is any longer. But it is not done for the British because they are living in it, right? It is still occurring. And that was all in regards to the 5th paragraph there on page 6. Now, you know, I don't want to gloss over too quickly, but the graciousness of some white people, because that's what he mentions in this paragraph, that he's been to some places where the white people treat him incredibly well. And it's shocking to Shisonka. Shisonka, it sounds like, is a light-skinned black person. We can go into far greater detail than that. Now, I'd imagine if this ends up being, you know, a story that you know, whenever you write about this story, that's something you want to take into consideration. But even as a light-skinned black man, he mentions he's gone into some of these countries where he's kind of surrounded. He's the only black man, and he's treated very well, which is all in contrast to how he is treated in South Africa, right? Just to discuss a quick point about the baby. It does say, we are alone together. This is Nanike's kind of internal perspective here. We are alone together. The baby likes him. It is interesting that the baby is having kind of an affinity with Shisonka, meaning that there's an influence that's starting to take place with the child as well. Shisonka, in a couple instances, is likened or is given feminine qualities. So maybe there's this idea that he is a competing sense of motherliness and nurturing to the child, and the competition, of course, is with Nanike. Maybe she senses that growing competitiveness, that kind of that contention, and that's why she eventually turns him in, because she doesn't want Shisonka and the ideas he represents to have a greater influence on this baby, which is essentially a tried and true kind of example of where the future might be headed, right? That's why children are always given such positive regard, because the idea is, how are they being influenced and how will they march toward the future? In the case of this text, will it be with a real sense of action and agency as who they are as South Africans, or will they simply kind of numb themselves to this existence of oppression and underneath this apartheid system in South Africa, right? How will this baby march into the future? And now we have two different mothers here. That's the only real sense that I can make of Shisonka at times being given these feminine qualities. But again, you might have some more that you're thinking about here too. Another motif here, which I won't spend time to analyze because I'm not too sure what to make of it, is the pullover or the hoodie that Shisonka is in possession of, and of course they give it to Nanike. Says that she will fix it for him, that she will mend it, but I'm not too sure what to make of it. The only thing that is mentioned here on the bottom of page 6 is they don't even know where he would need such a pullover. Obviously, where they reside, it's quite warm, and this kind of clothing is not necessarily needed, but the idea is he's such a kind of man of the world, and he doesn't know where his affairs will kind of pull him next, that he might need this hoodie, but there might be more of a meaning beyond that. It was mentioned on page 7 here that Shisonka knows that Samson's Sunday beer is retrogressive, that what it is as an act is antithetical to the action of defying and displacing authority. So he tries to kind of, convince him to give up that Sunday beer. The bottom of page 7 as well, it's really Shisonka that forces them to close up their home to all outside kind of interference and persuasion. He says, look, nobody must come here Saturday, Sunday, none of your friends, you must shut up this place, keep them all away. Nobody walking into the yard from the Shebeen, that's out. He is protecting the yard. It cannot be defiled. To want to matter-of-factly drink beer in the yard on Sunday is a resignation, a form, though subtle, of giving up, right? He wants to make sure that Samson, especially, who he has made some progress with as far as politicizing him and kind of creating an awareness, that he doesn't just revert to old habits and tendencies, which of course is to have a beer on Sunday in that garden, right? He says, he also makes sure that nobody will come in from the Shebeen, which is to essentially oust or prevent any alcohol or numbness or distraction from entering this home. It's almost in some cases like Shisonka has made such good progress that he doesn't want to spoil the progress that he's made with this family, especially Samson, maybe with the baby, and maybe even with Nanike, despite what she does by the end of this text. He wants to essentially shelter them and cut them off from the distractions of the outside world here, almost so they can sit and resonate with what they've learned. And all of this, I would imagine, is more subtle than not. Also, I just want to mention here, which kind of pertains to the what's happening at the top of page 7. James Baldwin, you're reading 2 short stories by Baldwin in this piece. He lives in France for quite some time, and that's why you have his very long piece that you're reading, where the character actually is kind of living in France, and he returns to the U.S. for some kind of trips, but of course most of it takes place in France. the idea was that a black man, from Baldwin's perspective, an American black man cannot live a life of decency in America because America has not created an environment where decency exists for a black man, right? So life is only possible, real life, right? Life of potential and freedom of dignity. Life is only possible for a black man in foreign places. And that's why Baldwin does essentially almost kind of expatriates to France, because he understands that there's much more life available as far as a black man trying to live out a kind of full life in France, because it ain't happening in America, right? That's the same idea that pertains to Shisonka when Samson wants to hear him talk about living in all of these foreign places, because it seems like he's experienced more humanity than, say, a black man living in South Africa, an African man living in South Africa, right, under an apartheid system. So I think a good question, which is open to interpretation, would be, in what way is Nanike a prisoner within this home? Is she a prisoner to Shisonka? Is she a prisoner to herself? Is she a prisoner to this child? Is she a prisoner to society? Is she a prisoner to the ideologies that are in conflict with the society that she lives in? So I know that's going to be a question that's vastly open to interpretation. In what way is Nanike a prisoner within this home? Strange detail, worth mentioning. They're talking about how are we such a popular place to visit. How are we going to keep people out of here? And he's like, I'll just tell them that I'm going to a soccer game on Saturday. And Nanike quickly corrects him and says, no, don't do that, because then people will want to come and talk about soccer with you the next day, or along those lines. And then he says, okay, I'll just say that I went to a funeral. So not sure exactly what some kind of precise analysis would be here, but you do have an interesting contrast between everybody being so obsessed with discussing a sport here, soccer, which is essentially like football across the world, right? The popularity of the football in America. And then he talks about, well, nobody's going to want to talk about a funeral and a death, right? And I think you can start to have some figurative understanding of what that death might be. The death of a people, the death of a potential of a people. Nobody wants to talk about that, but everybody does want to indulge in discussion and roundabout conversation of sports, right? But not death, right? Not the death of something. There's a constant cleaning of the gun here, and it's almost ceremonious, and there seems to be kind of almost like it almost seems to be like a real ritual of some sort here. And it's kind of an honesty shared between Shisonka and Nanike. It even mentions here in the middle of page 8 that he never takes out the gun when Samson's around. He only cleans it in this kind of ceremonious way with Nanike present. Another motif here that essentially is very open for interpretation is the sore on the back of his head, and she does point it out to him, and he seems to not want to talk about it whatsoever. Seems quite, I wouldn't even call it defensive, because if you're defensive about something, that means you're at least open to discussing it. He seems to avoid this at all costs. The men on the bottom of page 8 are actually likened to prisoners awaiting their last mealy pap of the day before being locked up for the night. So both these men, Samson and Shisonka, are likened to prisoners here, and the question is, well, how exactly are they prisoners, right? We need to articulate what their imprisonment is. Why are they imprisoned? How are they imprisoned? It's also mentioned at the bottom of 8, quote, he picks up the baby as if it belongs to him. This is Shisonka. I talked earlier about maybe that kind of contention or that growing influence that Shisonka is having even on this young baby, even on this young child, right? And he picks up the baby as if it belongs to him. And of course, that probably irks her and subtly plays into the fact that she will turn him in, that she will report him. I'm not sure. I'd be very interested in seeing your take on this. I'm not sure how much Nanike perceives Shisonka as a white man. We know that he is quite light-skinned, but I don't know how much she actually perceives him as a white man, and if that factors into her feelings toward him or her need to rat on him and turn him in by the end of this text to essentially, I guess in some respects, betray him, right? So I've mentioned this before, I just want to repeat it. We recognize that by having Shisonka in the house and therefore this forced quiet and isolation, it brings a new sense of their community to light, ironically in real darkness, right? That they are forced to keep themselves from the familiarity of their society and kind of reflect upon this new awareness that he represents. They have to shut themselves off. I think one of the main issues that she is dealing with, Nanike, she has a problematic way of thinking. She is content to kind of exist in the middle. She does not want to disturb the quaint life that she has, because within context, she does have some level of security within her society, right? Poor, but at the same time, a kind of stable existence. All aspirations of a better life, especially for other people, need to kind of stay away. Nothing but a distant consideration. But don't bring any of those aspirations here. Don't bring it to us within this home. As it is stated, things far away can't do any harm. So the ideas, that's probably her motivation for turning him in at the end here, right? If I can turn in Shisonka and therefore expel the ideas that he represents from my little home here, then there will be no influence, there will be no consideration whatsoever of the ideas he's trying to bring into this house, right? This need for action, this growing politicization of my husband and my family. And as far as that complacency for Nanike, you're getting a full dose of it in the middle of page 9 in the italicized passage, and everything in italics seems to be her internal thinking. And it mentions a city of the dead, a city of the living. It was better when Samson got him to talk about things like that. Things far away can't do any harm. We'll never have a car like the counselors, and we'll never have to run away to those far places like him. So there she is, neatly placing herself right in the middle. We'll never have a car. We'll never have the potential of what a car kind of brings to your life, not just on a literal level, but on a figurative level, meaning kind of, potential and limitlessness, things of that nature. We'll never have that car. We know it. However, we'll never have to run away like him because of the political actions that he decides to take, right? We'll have this quaint, fairly comfortable life, this safe life. That's probably the important word here. We'll have this safe life right here, right? Moving back into the text. Lucky to have this house. Many, many people are jealous of that. I never knew until this house was so quiet how much noise people make at the weekend. I didn't hear the laughing, the talking in the street, Radaba's music going, the terrible screams of people fighting. And that last detail, the terrible screams of people fighting, is pretty negative, right? Nobody necessarily wants to reminisce or reflect upon that as being something that makes their life worthwhile, right? Or something that brings some kind of comfort to their life. But that's what they like to hear, right? That's what she's reminding herself of, which is a very strange thing. Probably functions more on a figurative level than a literal level. She's happy to be right in the middle. She's happy to not take risks, and she's happy to have the meager existence that she does, which maybe can be said of people like us, or at least myself, I should say, in the middle class, or people living in the lower class of this country, who say to themselves, it's better to be safe than sorry, right? And why disturb what little kind of security and safety and comfort we have for some unknown potential where there is risk involved if I take action in some kind of way. A lot of this does plug in quite heavily to Thoreau's civil disobedience. It could almost be a companion piece side by side, because a lot of the ideas he's arguing for in that essay connect to what you have here, especially what we just read. However, if we're being critical of this, the more you try to be safe, the worse it will be for your children, is what Shisonka says at the end of this page. You think it's safer, but you are wrong. It's like you in the meetings. The more you try to be safe, the worse it will be for your children. That I'm just going to leave as a question, and I'll put that up for discussion. Why, if you try to be safe, will it be worse for your children? Remember, I mentioned the importance of children, the importance of this baby as far as the future is concerned. What path we might be willing to take, what challenges these children might be faced with because of the decisions that adults are making in the here and now. So my question for you is, why is it that the safer these adults try to be, Samson, Nanike, how will that make it worse for their children? And I want good articulation as you come up with some ideas there. I'll just mention this, the overall sense of Shisonka in the home. With this man in Samson's home, it is quiet. Quiet to the point that Samson can hear the frivolous, indulgent, and terrible pains of the outside world. The quiet that Shisonka has brought into this home has emphasized it. Quite direct on page 10. He's asking Samson and his wife if they're afraid. And Samson responds, yes, we're afraid, but of many things. When I come home with money, 3 times tsotsis, which is thugs, have hit me, taken everything. You see here where I was cut on the cheek. This arm was broken. I couldn't work, not even push the lawnmower. I had to pay some young one to hold my jobs for me. The man smoked and smiled. I don't understand you, you see. I don't understand you. Bring your children home, man. It is mentioned that Samson and Nanike are sending their children off into the cities to be educated, but the criticism could be they are being educated in a white person's world and sent back with white ideologies in mind. He's saying bring them back to where they belong, home with you. Let them learn from you. It's an interesting idea when we think about the education that minority groups receive. Is it conditioning them to, is it allowing them to work in their own self-interest, or is it just kind of prepping them and conditioning them and indoctrinating them to exist within a white-controlled world, especially as far as apartheid is concerned? Shisonka says, bring them home, man. We're shut up in the ghetto to kill each other. That's what they want in their white city. So on one hand, white society wants to separate and segregate. However, then it says, so you send the children away. That's what they want too. They also want you to separate yourself from your black children. To get rid of us, we must all stick together. That's the only way to fight our way out. There is a strong sense from Shisonka here of solidarity, right? That South Africans need to stick with each other, stay with each other, educate each other, and therefore they can work against the injustice and the oppression coming from an apartheid system. Lots of solidarity here. And then right after that night he asked if Moreke had a chess set, which is interesting because it's white and black. Another motif here being given to us toward the end here, right? And he even mentions that's the only way to fight our way out. That's the only way to disrupt and eradicate this system of apartheid, is to stick together, right? Not separated. Which leads us into the decision that Nanike decides to make. The decision that she makes, which is to turn him in. That's not sticking together. She seems to betray him at the end. So she does seem quite unguarded by the end of page 10 here. She even puts out a chamber pot, probably by the suggestion of Moreke, Samson, but they're still accommodating him kind of more. She even falls asleep in his presence, which is definitely to let her guard down here. But then she kind of wakes up. She says, should I go to Radeba's, which is the Shebeen owner? Should I go get a beer? And of course, the husband has to remind her, no. You know what he would say about that. So she does say that she needs to go get, this is on the final page, page 11, she says she needs to go out and get the baby milk. And who can deny a mother who says that she has to go out and get this important nourishment for her child, right? And this is where maybe it gets into some issues of kind of, gender roles and, gender issues, where she's just a woman. What harm can she really bring? Nobody's going to notice her leaving this house, which we've been trying to keep on lockdown for some time, and he doesn't stand in her way. This is when she walks out, and I just want to read this. This is when she walks into, or she runs into, the Shebeen keeper. This is on the 5th paragraph of page 11. She went out of the house just as she was, her money in her hand. Moreke and the baby were asleep in their room. The street looked new, bright, refreshing after the dim house. She likes the brightness of the street. The house has been so dim and kept in such an isolated state that being outside really kind of brightens her mood here. A small boy with a toy machine gun covered her in his fire, chattering his little white teeth with a rat-a-tat-tat. Now that is incredibly racially motivated as far as a description, right? She does walk outside of the house where she's been kind of isolated. He's been talking about stick to ourselves, work together, dispel ourselves, get rid of these white oppressors. And as soon as she walks outside in the new, bright, refreshing, morning that greets her, a boy with really white teeth basically starts spraying her with a toy machine gun. This is essentially for us as readers reminding her of what her society is, or what it's been built off of, which is a tendency of violence and oppression against Africans by the British Empire, right? Just a quick reminder. Moving on, Ma Radeba, the Shebeen keeper, her hair plaited with blue and red beads. Blue and red is definitely part of the flag of the British Empire. Her beautiful long red nails resting on the steering wheel was backing her car out of her gateway. Remember how privileged she is to have this car. She braked to let her neighbor pass and leaned from the car window. My dear, in English, of course, in English. My dear, I was supposed to be gone from this place 2 hours ago. I'm due at a big wedding that will already be over. How are you? Didn't see your husband for a few days. Nothing wrong across the road? I'll keep reading. Moreke's wife stood and shook her head. Radebe was not one who expected or waited for answers when she greeted anyone. So this is very abnormal that she's treating Nanike in such a way and being a bit attentive and considerate in her encounter with her. When the car had driven off, Moreke's wife went on down the street and down the next one past the shop where young boys were gathered, scuffling and dancing to the shopkeeper's radio, and on to the purplish brick building. Purple is royalty. If you look up the symbolism on purple, you tend to find royalty, which would make sense as far as a British Empire is concerned. Brick building with a security fence around it and a flag flying. One of her own people was on guard outside. Remember, black people, Africans are being utilized to protect white power, right, is the way that it's working here. So one of her own people, a black man, an African man, is standing guard to this white establishment, to this white institution. leaning on a hand machine gun. She went up the steps and into the office where there were more of her own people in uniform. They've essentially been commandeered by the British Empire. They're being used by the British Empire, but one of them in charge. And the one in charge, of course, is a white British man. She spoke in her own language to her own kind, but they seemed disbelieving. They repeated the name of that other police station that was blown up and asked her if she was sure. She said she was quite sure. Then they took her to the white officer, white, and she told in English, there in my house, 1907 Block C. He had been there a week. He has a gun. So we notice in this paragraph, her people are subservient. It is always a white British man in charge. We get the internalization of the woman here as well. As she says, bottom of page 11, I don't know why I did it. And that leaves it up to us as readers to speculate why she did it, right? We have to actually come up with some sound and firm and arguable reasons why she did this. I get ready to, and that'll be one of the questions up for discussion. Why did she do it, right? And this would lead to a somewhat of a paragraph response, I would imagine. I get ready to say that to anyone who is going to ask me, but nobody in this house asks. Nobody asks her why she did it. The baby laughs at me while I wash him. It almost seems like ridicule and guilt. The baby is probably a motif of the ridicule and guilt that she is now deserving of because she has turned this man in. Especially when you think about be safe now, but what does that mean for your children? Be safe now, but you're only going to make things worse for your children, right? Guilt, ridicule. The baby laughs at me while I wash him, stares up while we're alone in the house and he's feeding at the breast, and to him I say out loud, I don't know why. Notice that it's sad. She feels the need to apologize in some ways, or at least kind of express her confusion as to why she turned this man in, and she has to kind of express this to her child, right? She feels the guilt. And then, of course, the last paragraph here. A week after the man was taken away that Sunday by the security police, he's just a man now. It's not Shisonka, it's nobody, right? Just taken away. Ma Radeba again met Moreke's wife in their street. The Shebeen keeper gazed at her for a moment and spat. Just spits. Which is returning to the actual and real treatment of the British Empire toward Africans, toward South Africans. It's almost like she fell for it. She fell for that momentary kindness and consideration from Ma Radeba, but now that she has turned this man in and things are essentially kind of back to normal, now she expresses her true sentiment toward Nanike and who she is, who she represents, what she represents, and she is now back to spitting as far as her acknowledgement of her, right? So she fell for that feigned gentleness, that potential feigned gentleness and concern of Ma Radeba. You know, I think in closing, it's a culmination of discomfort for Nanike. Of course, you could point to the few different factors that lead to that level of discomfort. But in the end, this consideration of taking action against oppression, of actually recognizing the oppression that you are faced with, especially when we talk about apartheid South Africa, to have an awareness of it is discomforting. And then to have an awareness of it and then to realize that maybe action is required, like Shisonka kind of recognizes and commits his life to, that can be even more discomforting. And therefore, the easiest thing to do is to be happy with the little bit of comfort that you do have, with the life that you are allowed, not the life that you are allowed to strive for, and the potential that you are allowed to strive for, but the life that you are given as far as an allowance is concerned. She chooses to be happy with that and get rid of this unsettling understanding of the real injustice that she's faced with, and therefore she turns him in, right? I don't think I'm doing it justice. I think we can say a lot more about that, but I think that's by and large what leads to her decision to tell on this man, to essentially report him and have him taken away, right? It would have been on a literal level, it would have been very, how long do you have to hold on to this guy? Maybe the idea is forever on a figurative level, right? You always have to abide by the ideologies and the kind of belief system that this guy Shisonka represents. If you are truly trying to liberate yourself, this is an awareness that you must live with and cope with and acknowledge every single day of your life, right? Because you can immediately resort to numbness and distractions, which is not going to make things better for the future, which is a theme that's essentially laid out for us, right? Okay, very good. That was a pretty interesting lecture. Like I said, I'll have some discussion questions up so we can take some of these concerns a little bit further. Okay, have a good rest of your day.